Hey everybody, Yehuda Sunshine here from Cyfluencer for another awesome casual conversation in cybersecurity.
Hey.
Woo! Internet, thank you so much for coming. I want to invite you all to meet our guest, Jen Stone from Security Metrics.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming.
I'm so happy to be here.
So, normally we try and keep it pretty casual as the title kind of goes. So, maybe you could kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your background.
Sure. I've been with Security Metrics now for about 7 years. I'm one of their principal security analysts. I also get to do their podcast, so that's kind of fun.
Pretty
Um,
awesome if anybody hasn't
yeah,
checked it
well,
out.
it's great
It's
because you
cool.
get to talk to a lot of interesting people from a lot of different walks of the cybersecurity and IT and compliance, avenues. So I pretty much, if I see somebody and I think they're super interesting, I want to talk to them, and I can because I have this podcast, and people usually say yes. So that's kind of awesome. Um, Before that, I spent a little over 20 years in generally IT operations. So more the hands-on side of things, and then I did some consulting. So I have a pretty kind of broad background in technologies of various kinds, and it helps a lot when you're trying to have a conversation with a group about how are you keeping things secure. If you can speak the language,
Mhm.
it shortcuts a lot of things. But this is by far the most fun job I've ever had. If I had realized how much I would enjoy a security focus, I'd have shifted a lot sooner.
Mhm. So that's kind of something I want to touch on because I've spoken to lots of cybersecurity professionals, and a lot of them have that aha moment where they find out what the passion is in security, where they find their niche. And I would love to hear from your perspective over this entire journey. Was there a moment early on? Was there something as it was developing and you're understanding your skill set where you're like, I love this, I connect with this, or was it something? Was it kind of like an evolution?
Well, when I found out I got to go travel to Singapore and the Philippines and India and all these amazing places, plus cool places in the US. I mean, this sounds weird, but Fargo, North Dakota has a great little zoo. And so every time I get to go to a different place, and because of my job, it just adds that kind of color to the work itself. I really enjoy the puzzles that I get presented because everybody does things differently. So just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean you're in the cloud the way someone else is in the cloud. And just because you're in AWS doesn't mean you're using it the same way somebody else does. And so there's plenty of opportunities for learning how to do things, how each group solves kind of similar problems using similar technologies but not the same. And so it's never boring. So I guess when was my aha moment? So I didn't intend to take a job in security. So I was actually um, at the zoo in Utah. The zoo is a theme for me. I'm not gonna lie.
I
If
sensed
there's a
it.
zoo anywhere that I travel, it's part of the itinerary. You just have to account for that. So I
I
was
was
at
I
the
was at the
Hobel
zoo.
Zoo in Utah.
I was at the zoo last week, and it was like 105 degrees in the direct sun. I was like, this is what we're doing.
But
We just
still,
did.
it's the zoo. So no matter what, it's going to be better than pretty much any other thing you could be doing with your time that moment. So there, I was helping set up for a big event, and I got a phone call, and the guy on the other end started talking without. He's like, "Hey Jen, I got into the VPN and I found these files, and I was able to do these things." And I'm listening, going, does this sound like any of my customers right now? It does not. And so I stopped him. I'm like, do you have the right Jen? And he starts laughing. He's like, hey, Jen, this is Dustin. It's like, Dustin, that I got my master's degree with like 12 years earlier. It's like, yeah. And I was like, wow, it still has my phone number. That's awesome. So he asked me if I was still in IT. And I'm like, yeah, of course. He says, well, uh, are you interested in going into security? And I said, no. He says, well, I think you'd like it. Um, I'm working full time for this company in Utah County. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to do that. So as I'd had negative experiences working full time for companies before, and I will admit, most of it's me. When you have ADHD, you either find ways to turn it into a superpower or it just kills you. And having to be in the same chair with the same people doing the same work, I am not my best self under those circumstances.
Not even
So
heavily caffeinated?
yeah, so he said, but just come down and talk to my VP, who's Gary Glover. He's still my VP. Awesome guy. If you ever have a chance to chat with him, he just knows everything there is to know about like PCI compliance and that world. But he said, hey, if you'll come, just come and talk. And I was like, no, I have this customer. I have to go out of town. I'll be gone for 2 weeks. You can call me back. Because if you tell someone, call me back in 2 weeks, they don't.
That's not part of the feminine mystique.
No, it's just like people forget things in 2 weeks, or I mean, it doesn't matter enough to them to, but at 2 weeks to the hour, he calls me back. So apparently he figured out how to use a calendar. So he calls me back and says, hey, if you'll come down and talk to my VP, we'll buy you lunch at this Thai food place. Okay, fine. So for Thai food. So I drove down and talked to him. We sit down for lunch, and Gary says, so I hear you want to be in cybersecurity. And I said, no. And he says, well, let me tell you about the job. And I was like, okay, yeah. I mean, it sounds interesting, but I can't. And so at the end, it was like 2 hours later, he says, okay, before you leave, I know you think this isn't the job for you, but let me show you how we pay people here. And he pulls this folded up piece of paper out of his pocket and spreads it. He's like, okay, here's where people start. This is your base salary. And when you hit this milestone, this is where your base salary goes. Also, as you do audits, this is how the incentive structure works. So you'll know exactly the work you need to do to make the money you want to make. And I was like, that was so logical. I had to say yes. Because, okay, I'm going to tell you exactly what I said. It's kind of rude and really had the wrong mindset. But what I said was, you mean you're not going to make me negotiate for my salary and then pay me less because I'm female? And Gary said, well, that would be illogical. It was the best answer ever. And so, yeah, I basically signed, and then I had to do all these tests. Because I don't know if you knew, but to be a PCI compliance auditor, you have to have your CISSP or something equivalent and a CISA or something equivalent. And those tests they're no joke. So it was a solid month of study. But we got through that part.
That's a point that I kind of want to circle back to when we're talking about people getting into the IT field and getting into cybersecurity and trying to navigate the certifications that are actually worthwhile, that are going to push their career or their knowledge base, and this confusing string of letters and numbers behind their name that nobody can really quantify.
Yeah, for sure. There are certain parts of the industry that care a lot about whether you have a university degree, which a lot of people in cybersecurity will tell you is not going to get you forward. All it's going to do is get you past the hiring manager.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain certifications that some people place a lot of value in the industry. And again, is it for the job or is it to get you past the hiring manager?
Mm-hmm.
And so my advice to people is, instead of going out and getting all these certifications, which are expensive and they take time and effort, maybe decide what job you want and then see if there's an actual requirement for that certification or if it puts you ahead. And then all you have to do is get past the hiring manager, which is easier once you have some experience, and really, really hard when you start at the beginning and when you're looking for that entry level job, and it requires all of these things. Just to get your CISSP, you have to have, what is it now, 5 years experience in IT. And you're like, well, how am I supposed to get that? if I'm going for an entry-level job and I just told you I don't have experience, right? So balancing that out. One of the things that I have found is if you're applying for one of these larger companies, they use kind of a scanning program that looks at your resume and it looks for specific language in there. And so you can put things in there like willing to work towards a master's degree in cybersecurity. And then the thing goes, hey, master's degree, they can go to the next stage. When you're not saying you have it, you're saying I have credits toward it, or I am working towards it. CISSP eligible, which means you have experience, but you haven't taken the test. We'll get that language on your resume, get you past that first step to actually talking to a real human being, because a lot of times the person who wants to hire someone is not the person that's looking through resumes. They're not the one who's doing the initial interviews, and they often don't know how to phrase what they really need. And so a lot of stuff gets put into the job posting that isn't really required for the job. And I think we've all seen this. We've seen ridiculous requirements on these job postings that have nothing to do with the actual job.
5 more years experience than the language in existence.
Yeah, how am I supposed to put this on here? And so you, number one, do not want to lie, because you want to be clear on what your capabilities are. But number two, you got to recognize that there may be some automated word gatherers that you have to get past. How do you do that? So you kind of get creative with that. And then when you actually talk to a human being, you let them know and be just straightforward. This is where I'm at. This is what I know. This is what I've done on my own. This is what I believe I can do for you.
I mean, for me, it seems like what all of these different questions are turning towards is the need for mentorship, the need for some sort of guidance in a direct relationship. Because when you're saying, somebody trying to navigate the CISSP, and it's great, but if the candidate doesn't have somebody with 10 or 15 or whatever many years of practical experience to be able to look back at them and say, maybe just hold up. Maybe this is a better position and focus in on these practical skill sets. So, I know that you have a lot of experience both doing like mentorship with women in cybersecurity and in general. What do you think people should do to be more actively involved on both ends and being able to give back to the community, and then to be receptive enough that I need that help. I need to be able to reach out and get that guidance because I can't do it myself.
So I do mentor a few people actively, and there are other people who have reached out and said, will you mentor me? And I've said yes, but then they take no further steps. So people who want to be mentored, you need to understand that your mentor isn't putting together like a classroom experience or a step-by-step for you. Your mentor is somebody who's willing to take your calls or answer an email about specific questions or ideas that you have about your career path. I have I haven't asked her if I can say her name on the podcast, so I won't. But I have one who regularly reaches out and emails me, and we occasionally will get on a phone call. And it's just as much as this as, hey, I'm looking between these two positions. What do you think, knowing me and not knowing those positions, is the best way for me to get there? Neither of these is my final career path or career, desire, but does one of them get me there quicker than the other? So those are the kinds of things where if you have experience in the industry, you can kind of evaluate and say, look, this is going to be a terrible, awful job that you're going to hate for 2 years. It's going to get you where you want to be faster than this job that it's going to be nice, but it's kind of taking you away from your desired career path. And so knowing how to make decisions based on what's the next step after that job is often very difficult for a mentee to figure out on their own, where somebody who's been in cybersecurity for a while can just look at it and go, oh, heck yeah, I know what you're asking for. Let's talk about first of all, how are you going to feel in the job that you're going to accept? And second of all, what's the next step after it? Because sometimes it's hard to see that future state and people get fixated on where am I right now.
Mhm.
Sometimes where am I right now has to suck for a minute because it's going to get you to that next thing.
That's such a fascinating point, and it's like I think that especially for my generation, trying to appreciate the adversity that you have to put in, and that everything is not going to be catered towards your preferences to be able
Yeah.
to meet the needs of others. And I think that it kind of goes hand in hand with what I think is like so fascinating and so engaging about your podcast. It's like this effective cyber communication, where how can you speak these languages and how can you get these ideas across and connect with these other people and not speak to yourself.
Right.
And that's something that I really would like to kind of pick your brain a little bit in understanding, how these different experiences have forced you to say, I'm going to talk to the financial guy differently than I'm going to talk to the CTO versus the head of security. Because I think that like when I listen to security metrics, I think it's really cool that it's this blend of different personalities and different experiences, but the narrative and the style is accessible and communicated to everybody.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. That is my entire goal, because cybersecurity is this crazy like tightrope walk between talking jargon that turns a lot of people off because they just don't understand, and they're like, well, are you trying to make me feel stupid, right? Or on the other hand, are you being condescending and talking down to me because you're explaining it too much? And so finding what's that balance between making sure we're all understanding and going forward in a conversation together, when I know for a fact that I have people who are completely non-technical who listen to my podcast, and people who are highly technical and kind of intimidating, to be honest, listening to the podcast. And then the people that I'm talking to, especially when it's a more technical subject, getting them to pause for a second so I can maybe explain something and help the audience, get there together, um, without without putting the brakes on too much, so that people who have more technology understanding get kind of bored or frustrated with the pace. And so it's not always I'm not always super happy with it, turns out, but a lot of times it's great. And so
Mhm.
many of my podcast guests, they understand that too, because a lot of them are at a point in their career where they have to talk to different people of different technology backgrounds, different focuses. Like you said, somebody in finance who might need to have a conversation with somebody in cybersecurity. If they can't talk, it's going to affect both of them negatively. And a lot of times I hear my fellow cybersecurity people talk about how frustrated they are that they're the ones that have to be the translators. They're the ones that have to be that interface between the technology and the business side of things, or the non-technical frontline people. And I'm sorry that that's not fair, but it's true. And there are a lot of things in the world that are true but not fair. And I'm going to give you a couple other, I don't know what these are called, just like truisms or whatever. You need to remember that in order to have a successful conversation, it's all on you, but it's not about you. So you need to take yourself and your ego and get somewhere else so that you can have that conversation. You're responsible for whatever situation you're in, whatever conversation you're having, whatever issues arise. You are responsible for everything in your world. Even if someone else caused the problem, you're responsible for making it better, right? So if you go into every conversation you have believing that it's your responsibility to make this a successful conversation, you can do a little more homework on what the conversation is about. You're going to do a little more homework on how that person receives information. And you're going to be able to tailor that to them if you truly believe that communication is the primary thing, and not your yourself. Take yourself and make that not the important thing. That's it in a nutshell. And we're done.
I mean, it's so succinct, but especially in marketing, it's so hard to get through the noise and this just never-ending chatter of what we internally think people want to hear
Yeah,
without ever asking them. And I think that this is kind of something where it goes to accountability, where is the idea to sound smart, is the idea to hit those buzzwords and to be able to make it sound good in SEO, or is it to make an impact and to be able to change people's skill set and to make them more risk aware?
absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that you said risk, because a lot of times people think that security is a checklist of things that you just slap in. And if you've got that checklist, and this is where you've probably heard of compliance is not security. If you
Hmm.
think of cybersecurity as a checklist that's provided to you by whatever compliance standard you're following, then you're wrong. So, but if you think of it as risk based, you understand your systems, your people, your processes thoroughly enough that you know where the risk is related to the security controls, then you're going to right size those security controls so that you're not spending too much, but you're spending enough. And a lot of security people and compliance people will put things in to the maximum. We're going to put in the maximum security control on this thing. And then they realize, A, it's super expensive to do the maximum. B, the difference between an adequate security control and a maximum security control, what is the residual risk between those if you do the one or the other? They don't think of that.
Hmm.
And so knowing enough about the business side of things to do an adequate risk assessment on every step that you put in, not only are you doing your own security better, but it gives you the tools to speak to the business, because you're talking about risk. Risk is totally within the wheelhouse of business language. And
Hmm.
so if you can phrase security needs in terms of risk, risk to the business, financial risk to the business related to these cybersecurity things, then they're going to want to talk to you. You will have a seat at the table because you'll bring value to whatever business conversation is happening at those C levels.
I mean, and that's kind of what I'm going towards as well. Where it's how can the CISO and the designated security professional not just be this reactionary figure? They can't just be the guy running with the buckets. How can they form an actual relationship with the C-suite, with their team, with HR, and building this culture where everything is proactive and forward thinking? So, from
Right.
your perspective, do you think it's changing the culture from the top down? Is it something like, are there any magic bullets to be able to solve this?
So I'm gonna repeat what I said earlier about it's your responsibility to bring that communication to the table, even if you're not. And I know this happens a lot. CISOs are not always in the C-suite meetings, right? They might have that C in front of their name, but they aren't always considered on par with the other C's. And when I see that, it's usually because they are not speaking the language that needs to be spoken. Instead, they'll come to the C-suite with, "No, you can't do that," or "That's such a bad idea." Because from their perspective, they've already weighed the security implications and they've come to a conclusion, and they're just saying no. Well, that's not that doesn't get you invited to the conversations where these things are supposed to be decided.
Mhm.
So deciding between different security strategies should be done in concert with other C levels. And so if you look at, so there's a business unit that wants to do a certain thing, instead of saying, no, that's a terrible idea, you're a bad human, like that's, nobody's going to listen to you,
You can
and
still
they're not
believe
going to
them.
invite you to
You
the
can
next
still
meeting.
believe them. Just keep it a little bit closer to the chest, right?
So instead, what you do is like you just said, listen, what are they actually telling you? So a lot of times they'll bring, I want to use this tool. But what they mean is they have a problem they're trying to solve that they don't know how to quantify. They think that tool will solve it for them. So if you ask them, help me understand more about this tool, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And then they let them speak Even if you know the final outcome, even if you know everything they're going to say, let them speak. They need to be heard. They need to know that they have been heard. And so once they have spoken, then you say, let me tell you, let me make sure I understand, repeat back to you the problem you're trying to solve. Is that true? Correct. And you want to do it using this? Correct. Great. We can do that. Here's the additional risk that you're going to bring to the environment if we do this. That's acceptance of risk or mitigation of risk is a business decision. And so making sure that you focus on that, how do we do this from a risk perspective? And then don't just stop there. Don't just say, hey, that's super risky, we don't want to do it. Say, all right, there are some other ways to solve this problem that I can present to you. Either you have that knowledge in your head and you can just kind of spout it off there, or you find out what you say, look, I'd like to research a couple of other options that might be less risky, or that we can use this and also have this mitigation of that risk. Can I bring this back to you to the next meeting? And then all of a sudden, you're a valuable part of that ongoing meeting set where those conversations are happening. And you're saying, we can solve your problems while together discussing risk. And everybody feels like they are also an adult with the decision-making capabilities. And then here's the other sneaky advantage. If you're the one that says no and then it all goes wrong, it all falls on you and you get fired. You want that, right? Instead, if you're part of the strategic group that made a group decision on something and it all goes wrong, then you go back in the room and you're talking to them. Hey, looks like this happened. Looks like that happened. How do we do it better the next time? How do we mitigate risk now? How do we salvage this going forward? So instead of it falling on you, this is everyone was involved in the decision, and everyone gets to take part in the goodness or the not so goodness.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like changing the I don't know if it's the personality or the mindset of the security professional, where we're skill building, we're not fear building. That even as complicated as anything could be, we're here to be able to work as a cog to solve this problem instead of being the obstacle without a solution at the end of it.
Right. Yeah, I love that, because fear has been, the acronym FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's been the stick with which security professionals have beaten the business for too many years. And it at the same time that these behaviors are happening, people in security are saying, but why don't we have a seat at the table? Well, that's why. If you just bring fear, if you just bring uncertainty, if you don't clarify positions and help people understand, here are the different ways you can choose, and then have them be part of that decision making, then why should they have you in the room? All you do is come and spout fear about stuff you're not letting them do anyway, right?
Yeah, you're just waiting to be the fall guy for the next hack. I mean, it seems like the points that we keep on going back to over and over again. It's speaking the language of the others, being able to take accountability for your actions in the organization, and then also being able to work in that team culture. And for me, I've written a lot about trying to build cyber awareness and cybersecurity culture. And I wonder if this is one of the core cornerstones, that in order to be able to engage people, you have to first make them feel like they have a valuable opinion in the conversation. Just like the CISO wants to be at the table, anybody who's bringing the security concern, I'm going to be able to listen to it, internalize it, and take it seriously to break down some of that barrier of entrance.
Yeah, and how is that different in any relationship, right? Every relationship, if a person feels like they're not being heard, if communication isn't happening, it's just not going to work. Business, life, doesn't matter.
So what do you kind of transition in a little bit into some of your passions here? We've been talking a little bit about people getting into cybersecurity, understanding the trajectory and the certifications. what do you think industry professionals could do to make cybersecurity more accessible to minorities, to women? I recently wrote an article about, using cybersecurity certifications and education in prisons to be able to decrease reoffending by giving people the opportunity to really have a job based on their skill and their merit. Maybe they don't have to go to another alternative. So what do you think practically we can do to make it something that people can attain?
I think that cybersecurity started off very male dominated, like IT did. It was, and there was a culture there that was kind of exclusionary. But the longer it's an actual industry profession, the less that's true. So generally, what I see is, and I'll speak to women because that's generally been my focus in mentoring and my own experience, um, is that if you encounter a work situation where you feel like women are not valued, find a different work situation. Or you can be an activist, that's cool,
Mhm.
but just know you kind of have to make a choice. So if you're in an organization where you want to change their culture because you know they're negative about women, then go in knowing that that's going to happen, but your career is not going to advance,
Mhm.
right? So what is your purpose? If you want to be in cybersecurity, learn things, do cool things, be an active cybersecurity professional, then finding a good work situation for yourself probably is going to be more supportive of that ends than finding a difficult place and staying there. So my own experience in cybersecurity and in IT, I think I kind of alluded to it at the beginning. I worked for a few different companies um, that were very male dominated and uh, felt unsupportive of me personally
Mhm.
and other women that were in the group. And I wish somebody had told me earlier, hey, there's so many more jobs out there. You could go get one you actually like. But so I struggled through it and learned a lot of things while I was in the middle of it. And I believe one of the most important things that I learned, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but if you believe misogyny exists everywhere, if you believe that all old white males are out for themselves and to exclude everyone else, all you're going to see is that. Because
Mhm.
every time you run into a challenging situation, you're going to be like, oh, look, it's because I'm a girl. Every single time. If that's the mindset. And that's what I had. I had that mindset when I was, younger, especially because I got told that I should have that. I got told I should look out for that. I got told you're going to have a really hard time because you're female. And so every time I encountered a difficult situation, I was like, oh, I guess this is because I'm female. And I really internalized that. And then I had a mentor who said to me, hey, what if you pretended it wasn't because you're female? What if you straight up just ignored that or said to yourself, does this actually affect outcomes? Is this unpleasant person actually affecting my outcomes? And I would say if they are, you might kind of find another place because it's very,
Mhm.
very difficult to change other people's mindsets. But if they're not affecting your outcomes, you don't have to listen to them. Um, and as I practiced personal responsibility for every failure, and that was hard. I mean, that's really hard because sometimes failures are handed to you by other people. But if you live in those situations and say, I am responsible for this outcome. I took the job. I stayed in the job, right? Whatever it is, what was my part in this bad outcome? How can I make it better in the future? How can I look at it and say, I choose to take the responsibility for this? And there's so much magic in that because if you say, oh, I am a victim of this person's mindset, you rob yourself of the ability to change anything. But if you say, I am responsible for this outcome in any situation. You arm yourself with the ability to change what you can instead of getting mired in that frustration. And that comes from my personal responsibility. Yeah, comes from my personal experience working in some really negative situations that looking back, I'm like, oh, wow, that took me forever to learn. So
I mean, it's so fascinating to hear how, the the change in mindset can make such an impact in both your success, but more so in what the parameters of which you see are necessary.
yes,
You're not always going to check off every box, like you were saying earlier in the conversation. Sometimes you might need to take that difficult decision and work in the job that you don't want to, but there's an idea that there's an end goal, and being able to understand that structure of responsibility and accountability, and saying, just because it's difficult doesn't mean I should quit, and it doesn't mean that I didn't put myself here.
right.
It's very,
I think
very,
you hit the nail on the head there, because that end goal is something most people don't even think of. They don't have any idea of where am I trying to get to. And so instead they say, well, I'm just going to get a good job. What does that mean? What does a good job mean? Is it a job that makes you feel good about yourself because the title hits your ego in all the right ways? Is it something that is a certain amount of money? Is it something that allows you to travel or not travel? What does a good job mean? And so there can be so many things that can be an acceptable work situation if it advances you towards your end goal. But if you don't know your end goal, then acceptable work situations become more and more rare, because the end goal is today. Well, if you're starting off in your career and you're expecting to make all this money and have this corner office and all of these amazing, opportunities, that doesn't happen from the beginning.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's not fun for a few years.
Mhm. It's that tough love, that I think it's difficult to hear, but people need to be able to put it into context. It's not that there's no pain, no gain. It's, you need to put in your time and the experience to be able to be worthwhile, and to be able to make this worthwhile and important for your team. So
Yeah, accept that
yeah,
life is not fair,
yeah.
and do the thing anyway.
Mhm. So maybe we'll switch to a little bit lighter section here, the inside the actor studio section of our conversation.
Okay.
Rapid fire. What podcast should we be listening to right now?
Um, so the Jocko podcast, Jocko Willink, he talks about leadership, and it's not just if you're in a leadership position, it's about leadership for yourself. It's personal responsibility. Listening to him, I've taken a lot of the negative self-talk that I kind of got programmed in my head, and I get to listen to positive things about my efforts now. So that's one of them. Uh, I listen to some odd things like Welcome to Night Vale. Sometimes you don't have to learn something important all the time.
Mhm.
Sometimes you can just chill.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's kind of part of the point of these questions, where I see some cyber professionals where they think that I have to read every cyber book, and the movies I'm watching are cyber movies, and I'm only going to listen to techno, and I'm only going to wear a black hoodie, and I'm going to, it's like, it's this diversity. You need to have different interests. So what's your favorite book?
Oh, okay. This is gonna also sound crazy because I don't go to church, but my favorite book is the Old Testament. Because have you read the stories? They are crazy. There is some wild stuff that happens in those books. And it also, people don't understand, if they're not reading some of these foundational important works, they're missing out on an understanding of how and why we have basic laws and social constructs between us. Um, there's a lot of poetry that is either found in there or based on those things. So if you don't understand Old Testament, New Testament's pretty cool too, but also Greek and Roman mythology has a lot of really rich. These aren't just old stories. It's about people. It's like how people feel and think and relate to each other, and knowing these old fables and myths and stories helps you understand yourself, but helps you understand other people too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always find it fascinating that there are so many people who take on some aspect of religious identity, but they don't read the foundational texts. You know, if
Right.
you're taking on all of these things, you need to be able to understand. And you know, I go through it every day, and it blows my mind because it's thousands of years old, but it not only is not relevant, it's still relevant, but the nuances in every word. It's it's something that I wish writers were as precise and forward thinking as they were in the past.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that appeals to me. Now, I read probably or listen to like probably a book a week, and I do like science fiction and fantasy just as much as everybody. Maggie Stiefvater, um, probably everything she wrote. So
Very cool, very cool. And what's your favorite movie?
the original Star Wars Episode 4, and Han shot first. Do you know that I think that movie has been a really interesting kind of take on what's happening in our society, and kind of the rewriting of original things, because when they changed it so that Boba Fett shot first, I think they were trying to make it so, oh, Han's not the bad guy, but that's the whole point. He had a character arc. He was a pirate. He was a bad guy, and the arc through his time in those movies took him from I'm all for me to all right, kid, go blow up the Death Star, right? And so when you look at this rewriting of who people are in history, we make them much more one-dimensional. So looking at important people who were incredibly flawed should be a good thing, because it lets us say, all right, I can also be a flawed human. Let's do my best. And hopefully we'll have also my own character arc. But when we make people who are one-dimensionally heroic no matter what, and they never had a bad moment, they didn't come from a less informed place, how do we learn those lessons about becoming better humans ourselves?
I mean, it's difficult with the hagiography when you deify somebody. On the other end, I think it's very hard when you view people in the past through the ultra woke lenses of today, and try and put our current biases on something where it's like there are things that are objectively wrong, but you can't just pick out individual moments in history and use your optics to.
There are things that are objectively wrong to the mindset that you hold today. These things were not always objectively wrong to everyone looking at it. Doesn't make them bad people, and it doesn't make acknowledging that people had a different way of looking at things. It doesn't make you wrong for going, oh, they were a product of this normalized thought process, and we look at that today and go, how did they not know? How did they not know how terrible that was? Because they didn't. Or maybe they didn't have the tools to pull themselves out of it. I don't know. People are a lot more complicated than we let them be.
Yeah, it used to be easier. Before the internet, I guess people were just allowed to go back into their cave.
Yeah, it's having grown up. Oh my gosh, this is gonna make me sound old. I was born in the 60s, right? And so I really did grow up before the internet. My family had the first personal computer in the entire town. But it wasn't on the internet. We could occasionally connect to different networks that the universities and things put up, but there was no internet, there was no Google. You wanted to find things, you'd steal somebody's phone book, right?
I remember the New Year's Public Library desk reference, and it's like, I'm going to look this up now.
just imagine trying to drive. So I lived in Canada as a kid. Just imagine trying to drive from Canada down to the States somewhere with no GPS. You're like, I am here. I want to be here. I'm going to get these maps. Hopefully the roads are marked the same the way they are in the map. And then you just figure it out, what way is south. I think there's a lot of people that I grew up learning in the mountains how to find your way across country using a compass and the sun and a little bit of hope and desperation. Right? But I think that's a lost art. And so many people, I think, feel like real life it's just here. What do we do without these things? And if you can separate yourself from them and put yourself in an uncomfortable position of living in a more tangible reality, there's a lot of value in that.
They call it the phosphorescent blues. You're so caught up in the glow of your phone that you forget that there's other things around you.
Yeah, when you're sitting there texting the people next to you.
So yeah.
I mean, I can see it during a meeting. I've done that, but not when you're having dinner with them.
I can't even explain. I have one day a week where I'm not on my phone, and it's such a transcendental moment because everything is just happening. You're not concerned about what's going on a million miles away or checking your Facebook. You're just in the moment, and to be able to step out and understand that it's not about technology. Sometimes it's just about the people around you and the experience in the moment.
I think it's really wise. I think I'm going to adopt that one day away from the phone. Because my fear has always been, well, what if something happens? What if there's an emergency? Well, what if there is? What can I do about it? Is it okay if I hear about it the next day? Yeah.
It'll be fun.
It'll be fun.
So on that note, where can we find you? Where can we find more of your podcast, your speaking engagements, all that kind of fun stuff?
Sure. So Security Metrics Podcast, just Google that. It comes right up. There's so many. We're in our third year. I never knew that when I agreed to do it, that it would just go on this long.
Episodes, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting topics and episodes out there. I write also for the Security Metrics blog, and I've been so busy with that I've kind of neglected my own personal stuff. But occasionally on LinkedIn, I will put a post up, blog, ideas and thoughts that I have. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. As somebody who actively follows your material and really, as somebody who's trying to improve my communication in cybersecurity, I really look towards you and your voice and your understanding to be able to make better engagement. So
thank you. That means a lot to me coming from you, Yehuda. It's I hope that people find value in the conversations that I'm fortunate to have.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much, Internet. Have a good Labor Day, and feel good. Get a cold beverage.